The transport shuttle's engines hummed as it descended through the atmosphere of Nexus Prime, the galaxy's most prestigious educational hub. Sarah Chun pressed her face against the viewing port, watching alien cities sprawl beneath them like glittering circuits. At 19, she had seen more death than most beings witnessed in their entire lifespans. The scars on her hands told stories of plasma burns and shrapnel wounds, while her eyes held the weight of battles fought across three-star systems. The Terran-Zephyrian War had ended 6 months ago with humanity's unexpected victory. Now, as part of the peace accords, each species was required to send their brightest young minds to the Galactic Academy. Sarah wasn't bright in the traditional sense. She was a survivor. "Attention passengers, we are now approaching Galactic Academy Station," announced the ship's AI in its melodic, multi-toned voice designed to be pleasant to all species aboard. "Please prepare for docking procedures." Sarah gathered her single bag, containing everything she owned. Unlike the other human students who had arrived with hover crates full of belongings, Sarah traveled light. In war, possessions were liabilities. The habit remained. The docking bay buzzed with activity as hundreds of students from dozens of species disembarked. The air recycling systems worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric needs. Sarah noticed the careful segregation: oxygen breathers in one area, methane breathers in another, silicon-based life forms in their specialized environmental suits. "New students, please proceed to Registration Hall Alpha for orientation," came another announcement. Sarah followed the crowd, her military-issued boots clicking against the polished floor. She stood out among the other students, not just because she was human, but because of how she moved. While others chatted excitedly or nervously fidgeted with their belongings, Sarah scanned exits, noted security positions, and calculated potential escape routes. Old habits. The registration hall was massive, its ceiling disappearing into shadows high above. Holographic displays showed student assignments, dormitory locations, and class schedules in hundreds of languages. Sarah approached a registration kiosk, which immediately scanned her biometrics. Sarah Chun, human, species classification, Terran, the kiosk announced in standard galactic. Combat veteran status noted. Special accommodation protocols activated. Please report to Counselor Vexhai for psychological evaluation. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had hoped to blend in, to be just another student. The last thing she needed was special treatment that would mark her as different. The counselor's office was located in the administration wing, accessible through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished graduates. Sarah recognized some faces: brilliant scientists, renowned diplomats, successful traders who had shaped galactic civilization. She wondered what her portrait would look like, if she even belonged here. Counselor Vexhai was a Zillian, her crystalline features refracting light in mesmerizing patterns. Zillians were known for their empathic abilities and were often chosen as counselors and mediators. Her office was warm and comfortable, designed to put students at ease. "Please sit." Vexhai gestured to a chair that automatically adjusted to Sarah's physiology. "I understand you've recently completed military service." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah remained rigid, her hands folded in her lap. The war must have been difficult for one so young. Vexhai's voice carried genuine concern. "The Academy has protocols for helping veterans adjust to civilian life." "I don't need help adjusting," Sarah replied quickly. "I'm here to learn, like everyone else." Vexhai studied her for a long moment, her crystalline features shifting color slightly, a sign of deep thought among her species. "The Academy receives students from many backgrounds, Miss Chun. Some come from privilege, others from poverty. Some are naturally gifted, others work harder than their peers. But rarely do we receive someone who has seen what you have seen." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "The war is over. I'm moving on." "Moving on and healing are not the same thing," Vexhai observed gently. "Your psychological profile indicates high levels of hypervigilance, emotional suppression, and social isolation. These are common among combat veterans." "My psychological profile?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "Who gave you access to my military records?" "Standard procedure for all students. We need to understand each individual's needs to provide appropriate support." Vexhai leaned forward. "Sarah, you're not in trouble. We want to help you succeed here. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." Sarah stood abruptly. "Is this evaluation mandatory?" "No, but I strongly recommend." "Then, I'll be going to my dormitory now." Sarah turned toward the door. "One moment," Vexhai called. "Your dormitory assignment has been specially arranged. You'll be sharing quarters with 3 other species: a Corvian, an Altarian, and a Nexary. This is part of our integration program. Sarah paused at the door. Integration program. Another way of saying they were using her as an experiment. The dormitory complex was enormous, housing thousands of students in species-appropriate accommodations. Sarah's room was in Section 7 Delta, designated for oxygen-breathing species with similar environmental needs. She found her door and pressed her palm to the scanner. The room was larger than she expected, with 4 sleeping alcoves, a common study area, and a shared food preparation unit. 3 of the alcoves were already occupied, their owners having decorated their spaces with personal items, cultural artifacts, and study materials. Sarah chose the remaining alcove and set down her bag. She pulled out her few belongings, spare clothes, a worn datapad containing her military service records, and a small metal pendant her brother had given her before he died on Kepler 7. Everything else she owned fit in her pockets. "Oh, you must be our 4th roommate." Sarah turned to see a tall, willowy creature approaching. The being had pale blue skin, large dark eyes, and moved with an almost ethereal grace. This was clearly the Altarian. "I'm Lyralii," the being continued, her voice musical. "Altarians use feminine pronouns when speaking Standard Galactic, though our species doesn't technically have gender as humans understand it." "Sarah," she replied simply. "Wonderful. Korik and Zeph are in the study area working on tomorrow's assignments. Would you like to meet them?" Sarah followed Lyralii to the common area, where 2 other beings sat hunched over holographic displays. One was clearly Corvian, heavily muscled, with thick gray skin and small, intelligent eyes. Corvians were known as master engineers and builders. The other was Nexary, with smooth golden skin and intricate tattoo-like markings covering her visible limbs. Nexary were renowned for their mathematical abilities. "Everyone, this is Sarah, our human roommate," Lyralii announced cheerfully. Korik looked up from his display and nodded respectfully. "Greetings, Sarah of Terra. I am Korik, son of Korik, student of engineering." Zeph glanced over, her large eyes studying Sarah intently. "Fascinating. I've never met a human before. Your species' recent military victory was statistically improbable given the technological disparity." "We got lucky," Sarah said, uncomfortable with the attention. "Luck is a mathematical impossibility," Zeph replied. "There must have been factors that shifted the probability matrix in your favor." Sarah didn't want to explain that humans had won through sheer stubbornness, creative tactics, and a willingness to take losses that other species found appalling. "Maybe. Are you excited about classes starting tomorrow?" Lyralii asked, sensing the tension. "I'm particularly looking forward to galactic history and xenobiology." Sarah realized she hadn't even looked at her class schedule yet. While her roommates had been preparing and studying, she had been trying to convince herself she belonged here. "What's your field of study, Sarah?" Korik asked politely. "Good question." Sarah had no idea what she was supposed to study. The peace accords had simply stated that veterans would be given educational opportunities. No one had asked what she wanted to learn. "I'm still deciding," she said finally. Zeph's markings shifted color slightly, a sign of confusion among her species. "How can you begin classes without declaring a field of study? The academic pathways are quite specific." "Sarah's probably just being cautious," Lyralii interjected diplomatically. "Humans are known for their careful planning." If only they knew, Sarah thought. She had never planned anything beyond surviving the next battle. As evening approached, her roommates settled into their study routines. Korik worked on engineering schematics, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate as he manipulated holographic components. Lyralii practiced language exercises, her voice creating beautiful harmonies as she pronounced words in various alien tongues. Zeph surrounded herself with mathematical equations that floated in the air like glowing poetry. Sarah sat on her bed, staring at her class schedule. Introduction to Galactic Politics. Advanced Xenobiology. Interspecies Communication. Mathematical Foundations of Space Travel. Each course seemed designed for students who had spent their lives preparing for higher education. She thought about her last conversation with Commander Roberts before leaving Earth. "This is your chance, Chun," he had said. "Show the galaxy what humans can do when we're not fighting for our lives." But what could she do? Sarah was good at fighting, at surviving, at making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. She could field strip a plasma rifle in 30 seconds, treat combat wounds with improvised medical supplies, and keep her squad alive in hostile territory. None of those skills seemed relevant in a classroom. A soft chime indicated lights out in 30 minutes. Her roommates began preparing for sleep, each following their species' specific requirements. Corvians needed several hours of deep meditation, Altarians required periods of luminescent exposure, and Nexari entered a trance-like state while their markings pulsed rhythmically. Sarah lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling as the lights dimmed. Around her, she could hear the soft sounds of her roommates settling into their rest cycles. For the first time in months, she was in a place where no one was trying to kill her. She should have felt safe, relaxed. Instead, every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made her tense. She found herself cataloging potential weapons in the room, identifying cover positions, planning defensive strategies for an attack that would never come. Sleep, when it finally arrived, brought dreams of plasma fire and screaming engines, of battles fought in the cold vacuum of space, and friends lost to enemy fire. Sarah woke several times, her hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm that no longer hung at her hip. Tomorrow, she would walk into classrooms full of beings who had never known war, who saw the universe as a place of wonder and possibility rather than a battlefield to be survived. She would try to pretend she belonged among them, that she could learn to build instead of destroy, to create instead of merely endure. But, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to face her most difficult battle yet, the fight to discover who she could become when the war was over. The Academy's morning chimes resonated through the dormitory complex at precisely 0700 hours, though Sarah had been awake for 30 minutes already. Old military habits were impossible to break. She dressed quickly in the standard Academy uniform, a simple gray tunic that adapted to various body types and environmental needs. Her roommates were already moving through their morning routines when she emerged from her alcove. Korik was performing what appeared to be stretching exercises, though the movements looked more like a complex engineering problem being solved through physical motion. Lyralii hummed softly as she consumed a glowing liquid that smelled faintly of flowers. Zeph stood motionless before a holographic display showing complex mathematical equations, her markings pulsing as she absorbed information directly through her enhanced neural pathways. "Good morning, Sarah," Lyralii called cheerfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Fine," Sarah lied. She had managed perhaps 3 hours of actual rest between the nightmares and her hyper-vigilant scanning of every sound in the corridor outside. "First day of classes," Korik rumbled, his voice carrying the excitement he was clearly trying to suppress. "I have waited 17 cycles for this opportunity." Sarah grabbed a nutrition bar from her belongings and headed for the door. "See you later." "Wait," Zeph called out, her mathematical display dissolving. "Don't you want to walk to the academic sector together?" First day navigation can be challenging. The offer surprised Sarah. In the military, you learned to navigate on your own or you didn't survive. But she was trying to fit in here, to be normal. Sure. The walk to the academic sector revealed the true scale of the academy. The station was essentially a floating city, with multiple levels connected by transport tubes and walkways. Students moved in groups, chattering in dozens of languages while universal translators worked to maintain communication. Sarah noticed how naturally her roommates fell into conversation with other students they passed, how easily they belonged to this world. "There's the central forum." Lyralii pointed to an enormous open space where students gathered between classes. "And those spires house the advanced research laboratories." Sarah's attention, however, was focused on security measures. She counted surveillance nodes, noted the positions of emergency stations, and tracked the movement patterns of Academy security personnel. The habits of a soldier couldn't be turned off like a switch. Her first class was Introduction to Galactic Politics, held in a circular amphitheater that could accommodate various species' seating requirements. Sarah chose a seat near the back, close to an exit. The professor was a distinguished Zinthari with silver-scaled skin and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Welcome, students, to your first step toward understanding the complex web of relationships that govern our galaxy," Professor Kielthinner began. "Politics is not merely about power. It is about the delicate balance between countless species, each with their own needs, fears, and aspirations." As the professor outlined the course syllabus, Sarah found herself studying her classmates instead. There were about 40 students representing 15 different species. Most appeared to be around her age, though determining exact ages across species was difficult. They took notes eagerly, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely excited to learn. "Miss Chun," the professor's voice cut through her observations. "Perhaps you could share your perspective on the recent Terran-Zephyrian conflict?" The amphitheater fell silent. Sarah felt dozens of eyes focused on her, some curious, others calculating. She had hoped to remain invisible, but apparently her military record preceded her. It was a war, she said simply. People died. It ended. Indeed. But, from a political perspective, it represented a significant shift in galactic power dynamics. Your species demonstrated capabilities that many believed impossible. Sarah's jaw tightened. We fought with what we had. But that's precisely the point, Professor Kielfener continued, his scaled features animated with academic enthusiasm. Military history is political history. The tactics employed by human forces, your willingness to accept casualties, your adaptability under pressure, your refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds. These weren't just military choices. They were political statements about human nature. We did what we had to do to survive, Sarah replied, her voice flat. A student in the front row, a tall, elegant Celestian with opalescent skin, raised her hand. Professor, wasn't the human victory largely due to luck? I've read that several key Zephyrian commanders made tactical errors. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under her desk. She had been there when Captain Morrison held the line at Proxima Station with just 12 Marines against 300 Zephyrian shock troops. She had watched Commander Hassan sacrifice herself to destroy a dreadnought twice the size of her ship. Luck had nothing to do with it. An interesting perspective, Miss Velterra, the professor replied. However, I would argue that what some call luck, others might call preparation meeting opportunity. Miss Chin, would you agree? Sarah stood abruptly. Permission to be excused, sir. The professor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. Class is dismissed in 10 minutes anyway. Please review Chapter 3 for our next session. Sarah grabbed her bag and headed for the exit, ignoring the whispers that followed her. In the corridor outside, she leaned against the wall and tried to control her breathing. This had been a mistake. She didn't belong here, surrounded by privileged students who saw war as an academic exercise. Sarah, Lyraliai's voice called from behind her. Are you all right? Sarah turned to see her roommate approaching, her expression concerned. I'm fine. That was difficult, Lyraliai observed. Professor Kielfener is known for putting students on the spot, but I don't think he meant to upset you. I said I'm fine. Sarah started walking toward her next class. Lyraliai fell into step beside her. You know, on Altair Prime, we have a saying, the deepest wounds are carried in silence. It means that sometimes sharing pain makes it easier to bear. And sometimes sharing pain just gives your enemies more ways to hurt you, Sarah replied. They walked in silence for several minutes before reaching the Xenobiology building. Sarah's next class was Advanced Xenobiology, which sounded complicated enough to require her full attention. Maybe immersing herself in studying alien life forms would help her forget about the judgmental stares and casual dismissal of human sacrifice. The Xenobiology lab was impressive, with specimen tanks containing life forms from dozens of worlds. The professor, Dr. Marantai, was herself an interesting study in xenobiology, a symbiotic species that appeared to be part plant and part animal, with flowing green tendrils that moved independently. Today we begin our exploration of adaptive biology, Dr. Marantai announced in a voice like rustling leaves. Each species in our galaxy has evolved unique solutions to the challenges of survival. Some developed superior intellect, others exceptional physical capabilities. Some learned to manipulate their environment, while others learned to adapt to any environment they encountered. Sarah found herself genuinely interested despite her earlier frustration. Biology was logical, scientific, based on observable facts rather than political interpretations. For your first assignment, you will work in pairs to analyze the biological adaptations of a species you have not previously studied. I will now assign partnerships. Sarah's heart sank. Group work meant interaction, explanation, cooperation. All the things she was terrible at. Miss Chun, you will partner with Cadet Frexhai. Dr. Marantai gestured toward a massive figure in the back of the lab. Sarah turned to see the largest being she had encountered since arriving at the academy. Frexhai stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick, chitinous armor covering most of his body, and for arms ending in sharp claws. He was clearly Kytherian, a warrior species known for their honor-based culture and incredible physical prowess. As the class dispersed to begin their assignments, Frexhai approached Sarah's workstation. Despite his intimidating appearance, he moved with surprising grace. Greetings, Sarah Chun of Terra, he said in a deep, resonant voice. I have heard much about human military capabilities. It is an honor to work with a proven warrior. Sarah blinked in surprise. This was not the reaction she had expected. Thank you. I suggest we study aquarian physiology, HFY continued, pulling up a holographic display. Their ability to survive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments represents remarkable biological adaptation. As they worked together, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. HFY was methodical and respectful, asking for her opinions and listening carefully to her responses. Unlike her political science classmates, he didn't seem interested in analyzing the war or questioning human motivations. Your military service, he said during a break in their analysis. It was on the front lines, yes? Yes. Sarah waited for the inevitable questions about tactics or casualties. Instead, HFY simply nodded. Good. Theory without experience is empty knowledge. You understand survival in ways these others cannot. You sound like you speak from experience too. Kytherians begin combat training at age 6. He explained matter-of-factly. By age 12, we have our first kill. By 18, we are considered full warriors. I have fought in 7 border conflicts before coming here. Sarah stared at him. You're a veteran too? Yes. My clan leaders decided that learning from other species would make me a better warrior. So far, they appear correct. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Sarah felt like she was talking to someone who understood. How do you deal with all this? She gestured around the lab. The casual attitude toward violence, the academic discussions of war like it's some kind of game. HFY's expression, difficult to read behind his armored features, seemed thoughtful. I remember that most of these beings have never faced death. Their ignorance is not malicious, merely incomplete. They study war to understand it, not because they have lived it. Doesn't it bother you when they get things wrong? Truth is not diminished by misunderstanding, he replied. Our experiences remain valid regardless of how others interpret them. The rest of the class period passed quickly as they worked on their analysis. Sarah found herself contributing ideas and insights without the self-consciousness that had plagued her in political science. Biology was straightforward. Adaptations either worked or they didn't. Species survived or went extinct. There was no room for interpretation or judgment. After class, HFY walked with her toward the dining complex. Would you like to share the evening meal? I find that discussing the day's lessons aids in comprehension. Sarah hesitated. In the military, meals were functional, fuel for the body, nothing more. But she was supposed to be adjusting to civilian life, learning to interact normally with her peers. All right, she agreed. The dining complex was a marvel of engineering, with sections designed to accommodate the dietary needs of dozens of species. Sarah and HFY found a table in the general seating area, where species with compatible atmospheric needs could dine together. As they ate, Sarah picked at a standard protein ration while HFY consumed what appeared to be raw meat. Other students occasionally glanced their way. Sarah realized they made an unusual pair, the small human veteran and the massive Kytherian warrior. They stare because they are curious, HFY observed. Not many here have military experience. Do you ever wish you were somewhere else? Sarah asked. Somewhere with people who understand. Understanding is not given, HFY replied. It is earned. Perhaps our purpose here is not just to learn from them, but to teach them what they cannot learn from books. Sarah considered this as she watched a group of Altarian students nearby discussing their upcoming assignments with animated enthusiasm. They seemed so young, so optimistic about the future. Part of her envied their innocence. What if we can't fit in? She asked quietly. HFY was silent for a long moment. In Kytherian culture, we have a concept called Thexmar, the space between what was and what will be. Warriors returning from battle must learn to exist in this space before they can rejoin society. Perhaps that is where we are now. And if we never learn, then we create our own society, he said simply. Warriors must adapt or die. This is merely a different kind of battlefield. As they finished their meal, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at the academy, a sense of possibility. Maybe she didn't have to choose between being a soldier and being a student. Maybe, with time and effort, she could learn to be both. 3 weeks into the semester, Sarah had settled into a routine that kept her functioning, if not exactly thriving. She attended classes, completed assignments, and participated in group work when required. Her grades were decent, though her professors noted her tendency to provide brief, factual responses rather than engaging in the theoretical discussions they encouraged. The real challenge came during her interspecies communication class, taught by Professor Quindal, a meridian whose tentacle-like appendages shifted color based on emotional states. The class was designed to teach students how to navigate the complex cultural differences that made galactic civilization possible. Today we will practice conflict resolution, Professor Quindal announced, her appendages cycling through calming blue hues. You will work in groups of 4 to resolve a simulated diplomatic crisis. Each group member will represent a different species perspective. Sarah found herself grouped with Valterra, the elegant Celestian who had questioned human military competence in political science class, along with a nervous Frenari named Pipchu whose species was known for their extreme pacifism, and Korak, her Corvian roommate. The scenario involved a disputed mining claim between 2 allied species, with each side claiming cultural and legal rights to a strategically important asteroid. It should have been a straightforward negotiation exercise. Clearly, the Nexari claim is superior, Valterra declared immediately. They discovered the asteroid first and have legal documentation to prove it. Pipchu's whiskers twitched nervously. But the Altarians have cultural ties to that star system. Surely we must consider their spiritual connection to the area. Cultural ties are irrelevant in matters of law, Valterra replied dismissively. Emotion cannot supersede legal precedent. Korak rumbled thoughtfully. Both perspectives have merit. Perhaps we can find a compromise that honors both claims. Sarah listened to the debate escalate, watching Valterra's confident dismissal of the Altarian position, Pipchu's increasingly agitated attempts at peacemaking, and Korak's patient efforts to find middle ground. It reminded her of war councils she had sat through, where politicians and generals argued about strategy while soldiers prepared to die for their decisions. Sarah? Professor Quindal's voice interrupted her thoughts. Your species' perspective on this conflict? Sarah looked up to find the entire class watching her. It doesn't matter who's right. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Valterra's eyebrows rose in elegant arcs. Of course it matters, Valterra said. Legal precedent is the foundation of civilized society. No, Sarah replied, her voice steady. What matters is what each side is willing to sacrifice to get what they want, and whether the cost is worth the price. Professor Quindal's appendages shifted to an intrigued purple. Can you elaborate? Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of the entire class's attention. The Nexari have legal documentation. The Altarians have cultural claims. Both sides believe they're right. In a real conflict, this wouldn't be resolved by debate or legal precedent. It would be resolved by whoever has more ships, better weapons, or stronger allies. That's a rather cynical view, Valterra observed coolly. It's a realistic view. Sarah's voice hardened. You can talk about law and culture and spiritual connections all you want, but when resources are limited and both sides need the same thing to survive, diplomacy fails. Always. Pipchu's whiskers trembled. Surely there must be peaceful solutions. There are, Sarah interrupted. But they require one side or both sides to give up something they value. And most beings aren't willing to make real sacrifices until the alternative is death. The classroom had fallen completely silent. Sarah could feel the uncomfortable tension radiating from her classmates. She had crossed some invisible line, spoken a truth they weren't ready to hear. Professor Quindal's appendages had shifted to a complex pattern of orange and gold. Miss Chen, your perspective is illuminating. How would you resolve this particular scenario? Sarah looked at the holographic display showing the disputed asteroid. Find out what each side really needs, not what they want. The Nexari claim legal rights, but why do they need this specific asteroid? The Altarians claim cultural ties, but what do those ties actually provide them? Once you know what each side truly requires for survival or prosperity, you can find alternatives that meet those needs without direct conflict. And if no alternatives exist, then you prepare for war, Sarah said simply. Because it's coming whether you want it or not. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah sat back down, aware that she had probably confirmed every stereotype her classmates held about humans and their supposed obsession with violence. Valterra was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled. That's exactly the kind of thinking that led to the Terran-Zephyrian War in the first place. Sarah's hands clenched under the desk. The war started because the Zephyrians wanted our colony worlds and thought we were too weak to stop them. Diplomatic solutions only work when both sides want peace more than they want to win. The Zephyrians had legitimate concerns about human expansion. The Zephyrians killed 3 million civilians on Kepler 7. Sarah's voice cut through the classroom like a blade. My brother was one of them. He was a teacher, not a soldier. He died because the Zephyrians decided that human lives were an acceptable cost for their expansion goals. The classroom erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Velterra's opalescent skin had shifted to a paler hue, her composure clearly shaken. Professor Quindal's appendages cycled through rapid color changes before settling on a deep, calming blue. Class dismissed. Please review chapters 7 through 9 for next session. Students began filing out quickly, most avoiding eye contact with Sarah. She gathered her materials slowly, aware that she had probably just destroyed any chance of fitting in normally with her peers. Sarah. Korik's deep voice stopped her at the door. That was well said. She looked up at him in surprise. You agree with me? I agree that pretty words cannot stop determined enemies, he replied. Corvians learned this truth long ago. Perhaps these others will learn it before they need to. As they walked toward the dormitory together, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that at least one classmate understood her perspective, regret that she couldn't seem to express her views without alienating others. You know, Korik continued, strength is not always about building weapons. Sometimes it is about building the will to use them when necessary. That evening, Sarah sat in her alcove reviewing her xenobiology notes when Lyrelii approached hesitantly. Sarah, could we talk? Sarah looked up from her datapad. About what? About what happened in class today. Lyrelii settled gracefully onto the edge of Sarah's bed. I heard about the discussion in interspecies communication. News travels fast. This is a small community, Lyrelii replied. And, what you said, it upset some people. Sarah set down her datapad. Let me guess. They think I'm some kind of warmonger who sees violence as the solution to every problem. Some do, Lyrelii admitted. But, others are beginning to understand that your perspective comes from experience they lack. Experience they don't want to have, Sarah said bitterly. And, I don't blame them. War is hell, Lyrelii. I wouldn't wish what I've seen on anyone. Lyrelii's large eyes studied Sarah carefully. Then, why do you seem to advocate for it? I don't advocate for war, Sarah replied, her voice tired. I accept that it exists. There's a difference between wanting something and acknowledging its reality. They sat in silence for several minutes before Lyrelii spoke again. On Altair Prime, we have no military. We've never needed one because we've never encountered aggression we couldn't resolve through negotiation or simply leaving. That sounds nice. It is. But it also means we have no understanding of what to do when negotiation fails, and leaving isn't an option. Lyrelii's voice was thoughtful. Perhaps that's why the Academy brought veterans like you and Threxhai here. Not just to learn from us, but to teach us things we've never had to learn. Sarah looked at her roommate with new respect. You really believe that? I think the galaxy is changing, Lyrelii replied. The war between your people and the Zephyrians proved that peaceful species can be targeted by aggressive ones. If we're going to maintain galactic civilization, we need to understand both peace and war. The next day brought Sarah's favorite class, Advanced Xenobiology with Dr. Marantai. She and Threxhai had been making good progress on their Aquarian physiology project, and she was looking forward to presenting their findings. But, as she entered the lab, she noticed an unusual tension in the room. Students clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Dr. Marantai stood at her podium, her green tendrils moving in agitated patterns. Students, please take your seats, the professor announced. We have received urgent news that affects our academic community. Sarah felt her combat instincts activate automatically. Urgent news in her experience usually meant incoming threats. The Galactic Council has received reports of aggressive actions by the hegemony of Kresh, Dr. Marantai continued. 3 trade convoys have been attacked in the past week. There are concerns about escalating tensions. Pipchu, the nervous Frenari from Sarah's communication class, raised a trembling hand. Professor, are we safe here? The Academy is neutral territory, Dr. Marantai replied. We remain under the protection of the Galactic Council Accords. However, the administration has implemented enhanced security protocols as a precautionary measure. Sarah and Threxhai exchanged glances. Enhanced security protocols usually meant someone in authority was more worried than they were admitting publicly. Dr. Marantai, Velterra called out. Surely this is just a misunderstanding? The Kresh have been peaceful for decades. Peaceful species can become aggressive when circumstances change, Dr. Marantai replied carefully. Economic pressures, resource scarcity, political upheaval, many factors can destabilize established patterns. Sarah noticed several students looking in her direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. She was probably the only person in the room with actual combat experience against the Kresh. She had fought them briefly during a border skirmish 2 years ago. After class, a small group of students approached her in the hallway. Pipchu led them, his whiskers twitching nervously. Sarah, he began hesitantly. We were wondering, if there really is trouble with the creche, what should we expect? The question caught her off guard. These were the same students who had been uncomfortable with her violent perspective just days ago. Now they wanted her expertise. Why are you asking me? Because you fought them before, another student replied. We researched your military record after yesterday's discussion. You have experience that could help us understand the threat. Sarah looked at the small group, representatives of 4 different species, all looking to her for guidance they couldn't get from textbooks or professors. The irony wasn't lost on her. The creche are methodical, she said finally. They don't act impulsively. If they're attacking trade convoys, it's because they've decided the benefits outweigh the risks. That means they either need something desperately, or they believe they can win a larger conflict. But the academy is neutral. Neutrality is a political concept, Sarah interrupted gently. In war, there are only targets and non-targets. If the creche decide this station has strategic value, neutral status won't protect us. Pipchu's entire body was trembling now. What should we do? Sarah looked at the frightened faces around her and felt something shift inside her chest. These beings were seeking her guidance not because they wanted to understand violence, but because they were afraid and needed someone who could help them prepare for possibilities they couldn't imagine. Learn, she said simply. Learn everything you can about emergency procedures, evacuation routes, and basic survival skills. Hope you never need them, but be ready in case you do. As the group dispersed, HFY approached from where he had been observing quietly. Well spoken, he rumbled approvingly. You begin to understand your role here. What role is that? The bridge, he replied. Between the world these beings know and the world they may need to face. That night, Sarah lay in her bed listening to the normal sounds of the dormitory, students studying, talking, living their lives without fear. But underneath the routine sounds, she could hear something else, the subtle changes that indicated increased security patrols, modified access protocols, and heightened alert status. The war might be coming to the academy whether anyone wanted it or not. And when it did, Sarah would be ready. The question was whether she could help her classmates be ready too. The attack came 3 days later, during the early morning hours when most students were asleep. Sarah woke to the piercing wail of emergency klaxons, a sound that sent ice through her veins and activated every combat reflex she possessed. She was out of bed and reaching for her sidearm before she remembered she no longer carried one. Around her, her roommates were struggling to wake up, confused by the unfamiliar sound. What's happening? Lyralii called out, her usually musical voice strained with fear. Attack, Sarah replied curtly, already pulling on her boots. Everyone get dressed. Now. The dormitory's emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through their small viewport, Sarah could see flashes of weapons fire in the space beyond the station. The creche had come. Her door chimed with an incoming communication. Sarah activated the display to see HFY's armored face. Sarah Chun. The Academy's security forces request all students with military experience to report to Emergency Coordination Center immediately. On my way, she replied, then turned to her roommates. Stay together. Follow evacuation procedures exactly. Don't try to be heroes. Sarah, wait, Lyralii started. I'll find you after this is over, Sarah promised, then headed for the door. The corridors were chaos. Students ran in every direction, some following evacuation procedures, while others stood frozen in confusion. Academy security personnel tried to maintain order, but it was clear they were overwhelmed by the situation. Sarah moved against the flow of fleeing students, her military training allowing her to navigate efficiently through the panic. She reached the Emergency Coordination Center to find it buzzing with activity. Multiple species worked at holographic displays showing the battle unfolding around the station. Chun, a voice called out. Sarah turned to see Admiral Vorthak, a Zinthri officer she recognized from her military service briefings. Glad you're here. We need every experienced soldier we can get. What's the situation, sir? Creche Task Force, 6 heavy cruisers, and multiple support vessels. They've disabled our defensive platforms and are moving in for boarding operations. Admiral Vorthak's scaled features were grim. Station security wasn't designed to repel a full military assault. Sarah studied the tactical display. The Academy's defenses were impressive for protecting against pirates or minor threats, but they were no match for a coordinated military attack. The creche had planned this carefully. Estimated boarding force? At least 3,000 troops across multiple insertion points. Admiral Vorthak highlighted several sections of the station on the tactical display. We have perhaps 500 security personnel, most with no combat experience. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. Without intervention, the station would fall within hours. What about evacuation? Sarah asked. Transport capacity is limited. We can evacuate perhaps 60% of the station's population before the creche complete their boarding operations. 40%. Sarah did the quick calculation. Nearly 10,000 beings who couldn't be evacuated in time. Students, professors, staff members from dozens of species, all trapped when the creche completed their assault. Sir, what are the creche after? This doesn't fit their usual operational patterns. Admiral Vorthak's expression darkened. Intelligence indicates they're targeting specific individuals, key researchers, political figures, children, military veterans. They intend to use hostages to leverage political concessions from member species. The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. The Academy wasn't just an educational institution. It was a collection of the galaxy's future leaders, scientists, and decision-makers. In creche hands, they would represent devastating leverage over galactic politics. What do you need from me? Sarah asked. We're organizing defensive positions at key choke points. Your combat experience could help coordinate civilian security personnel who've never faced this kind of threat. Sarah nodded and was about to respond when another voice cut through the command center's noise. Admiral. HFY approached with several other figures Sarah recognized. Cadet Morthek, a Draconian with pilot training. Lieutenant Zarfiz, a Corvian engineering student who had served in his species' technical corps. And, surprisingly, Velterra, the Celestian who had questioned human military competence. Cadet HFY reporting, Sir, the Kytherian rumbled. We volunteer for combat assignments. Admiral Vorthak studied the group. Most of you are students, not soldiers. With respect, sir, Velterra interjected, her usual elegance replaced by steely determination. Recent events have taught us that the distinction may be less important than we believed. Sarah looked at her former classmate with new respect. Velterra, you don't have combat training. No, the Celestian replied. But I have intelligence training and knowledge of creche tactical doctrine. I can be useful. Admiral Vorthak made a quick decision. Very well. Chun, I'm giving you a temporary commission as defense coordinator. Take this group and organize resistance at Sector 7. That's where the main boarding force will likely attempt to establish their beachhead. Understood, sir. Sarah turned to her improvised squad. Anyone who doesn't want to do this can leave now. No judgment, no shame. This is going to be dangerous. No one moved. All right then. Let's go save some lives. The transit to Sector 7 gave Sarah time to assess her resources. HFY was an experienced warrior, easily the most combat-capable member of their group. Morthek had pilot training, but limited ground combat experience. Zarfiz knew the station's systems better than anyone. Velterra's intelligence background could be invaluable for predicting enemy movements. What's the plan? HFY asked as they approached their assigned sector. Creche boarding tactics favor overwhelming force at primary insertion points. Velterra provided. They'll establish a beachhead, then spread out to secure strategic objectives. Sarah nodded. So we don't fight them at the insertion point. We can't win that fight. We let them establish their beachhead, then hit them when they spread out. Divide their forces, pick them off in smaller groups. That's a delaying action, Morthek observed. We can't hold them indefinitely. We don't need to hold them indefinitely, Sarah replied. We just need to buy time for evacuation and hope reinforcements arrive. They reached Sector 7 to find it already in chaos. Academy security forces were trying to establish defensive positions, but their lack of combat experience showed. Students and staff members ran through corridors in panic, hampering the defenders' efforts to organize. Sarah took charge immediately. Zarfiz, find me control of the sector's environmental systems. HFY, start organizing the security teams into coherent units. Velterra, I need you to coordinate information flow. Who's where, what the creche are doing, evacuation status. Morthek, see if you can find any way to support evacuation efforts. As her team dispersed, Sarah began the grim work of preparing for battle. The security personnel were brave, but untrained for this kind of fight. She needed to find ways to use their courage effectively without getting them all killed. The first creche boarding pods breached the station's hull 20 minutes later. Sarah watched on security monitors as armored soldiers poured through the breach points, their movements efficient and coordinated. These weren't random raiders. They were professional military units executing a well-planned operation. First wave incoming, she announced over the comms system. All units, remember the plan. Let them pass the first checkpoint, then close in behind them. Sarah had positioned her forces in a modified defense in depth, multiple fallback positions designed to fragment the attacking force and force them to fight in smaller groups where the Academy's defenders might have a chance. The first Kresh unit moved through their initial defensive line exactly as predicted. Sarah waited until they were committed to advancing, then activated her trap. Zarfiz now. The Corvian engineer triggered emergency bulkheads behind the advancing Kresh soldiers, cutting them off from reinforcement. Simultaneously, Academy security teams emerged from concealed positions to engage the isolated enemy unit. The fight was brief, but vicious. The Kresh were better trained and equipped, but they were caught off guard and outnumbered. Sarah's tactical planning made the difference. The Academy forces won their first engagement. Good work, Sarah called out over the comm. Repositioned to checkpoint 2. Next wave will be larger. But, as they prepared for the next attack, Velterra approached with troubling news. Sarah, I've been monitoring Kresh communications. They're not just trying to capture the station. They're specifically hunting for human and Kytherian students. Us, veterans. They want to eliminate or capture anyone with combat experience who might organize resistance. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The Kresh weren't just after hostages. They were after her, and HFY specifically. Which meant, it's a trap, she realized. They're using the boarding action to draw us out, identify us, then eliminate us. What do we do? Sarah looked at the tactical display showing Kresh forces advancing through multiple sectors of the station. Thousands of students and staff members were trapped, waiting for evacuation that might never come. Her improvised defense force was buying time, but at terrible cost. She could run, try to escape with the other evacuees, leave the station's defense to others. It would be the smart tactical choice, preserve herself to fight another day. But, as she watched a group of terrified Frenari students huddled in a corridor, waiting for rescue, she knew she couldn't abandon them. We do our job, she said finally. We hold the line. The next wave of Kresh soldiers was indeed larger, nearly 100 troops advancing in coordinated formation. Sarah's defenders were outnumbered 4-1, fighting an enemy with superior training and equipment. But they had something the Kresh didn't expect, creativity born of desperation and a human veteran who had learned to win battles that couldn't be won. All units, execute Omega Protocol, Sarah announced. Omega Protocol was something she had developed during the war, a last resort tactic that turned a defensive position into a massive trap. It required sacrificing territory to lure the enemy into a kill zone, then bringing down the entire sector around them. Sarah, HFY's voice was concerned. Omega Protocol will destroy this entire section of the station. I know. Sarah's finger hovered over the activation control. Zarfiz, how many civilians are still in Sector 7? Evacuation is 90% complete, the engineer reported. Perhaps 50 beings remain, all moving toward evacuation points. And how many Kresh? Approximately 200 troops, with more incoming. Sarah closed her eyes. 50 civilians versus 200 enemy soldiers, with thousands more lives hanging in the balance. The mathematics of war were always cruel. All friendly forces, evacuate Sector 7 immediately, she announced. I'm bringing it down in 60 seconds. The next minute stretched into eternity as Sarah watched her people retreat, watched the Kresh advance deeper into her trap, watched the civilian evacuation status tick toward completion. At 58 seconds, the last friendly force cleared the blast zone. At 59 seconds, Sarah activated Omega Protocol. Sector 7 collapsed in a controlled implosion that turned 3 levels of the station into twisted metal and debris. The advancing Kresh forces were crushed or trapped, their advance halted completely. The station shuddered around them as structural damage spread. Sarah had bought time for evacuation, but at the cost of significant infrastructure damage. All units, fall back to Sector 5, she ordered. Prepare for final defensive positions. But, as her forces regrouped, Admiral Vorthak's voice crackled over the comm system. All stations, this is Admiral Vorthak. Galactic Defense Force units have arrived and are engaging the Kresh fleet. Enemy forces are beginning to withdraw. Sarah slumped against a bulkhead, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. They had held. Against overwhelming odds, they had held long enough for help to arrive. HFY approached, his armor scarred from the fighting. Well fought, warrior. How many? Sarah asked quietly. Enemy casualties approximately 400. Our losses, 37 killed, 91 wounded. 37 dead. Sarah added their names to the long list she carried in her memory, beings who had died fighting under her command. But, around them, thousands of students and staff members were still alive, still free, still able to continue their lives and studies. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. In the aftermath, as rescue teams tended to wounded and damage assessment teams surveyed the destruction, Sarah found herself in the Academy's medical bay. She wasn't seriously injured, just exhausted and suffering from minor wounds. But the medical staff insisted on checking everyone who had been in combat. As she waited for treatment, Lyralii appeared at her bedside, her usually composed features tear-streaked with worry. Sarah, I was so frightened when I heard you were in the fighting. I'm okay, Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. She would carry the memory of this battle, like all the others, for the rest of her life. They're saying you saved the station, Lyralii continued. That without your leadership, the creche would have succeeded. I just did what needed to be done. But, as Lyralii hugged her carefully, mindful of her injuries, Sarah realized something had changed. She was still a warrior, that would never change. But, she was also something else now. A protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, a bridge between the violent realities of the galaxy and the peaceful aspirations of civilization. In the days that followed, as the Academy rebuilt and resumed normal operations, Sarah found her place in the student body had changed dramatically. Her classmates no longer saw her as a curiosity or a threat, but as someone who had stood between them and destruction when it mattered most. Professor Keelthaner approached her after her first political science class following the attack. Miss Chun, he said, his scaled features showing deep respect. I owe you an apology. I treated your military experience as an academic curiosity rather than recognizing its true value. No apology necessary, sir. You couldn't have known what was coming. But you did, didn't you? Your warnings about the reality of conflict. They were based on understanding the galaxy as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. Sarah considered this. I think both perspectives are necessary, sir. Someone needs to work toward the galaxy we wish for, even while others prepare for the galaxy that exists. Professor Keelthaner nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that's why you're here, to help us understand how to bridge that gap. That evening, Sarah sat in her dormitory's common area with her roommates and several other students who had become regular visitors. They were working on assignments together, discussing their studies, planning for upcoming exams. Normal student activities. But Sarah noticed that their discussions now included practical elements that hadn't been there before: emergency procedures, basic survival skills, awareness of potential threats. The attack had taught them that knowledge of peaceful civilization needed to be balanced with understanding of its fragility. Sarah, Velterra said during a break in their studies, I've been thinking about what you said in our first communication class, about strength being necessary to preserve peace. What about it? I think I understand now. Not everyone can be a warrior, but everyone needs to understand why warriors exist. Sarah looked around the room at her classmates, beings from a dozen different species, studying to become scientists, diplomats, artists, teachers. They were still the same optimistic young scholars they had been before the attack, but now they carried a deeper understanding of the complexity of the galaxy they hoped to shape. Maybe that's enough, Sarah said quietly. Maybe understanding is the first step toward building something better. Threx High, who had been accepted into their study group despite his intimidating appearance, looked up from his engineering homework. In Kytherian philosophy, the strongest fortifications are those that never need to be tested. And the best warriors, Sarah added, are those who make warfare unnecessary. As she looked around the room at her friends and classmates, Sarah realized she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a purpose beyond survival, beyond the next battle. She could use her knowledge of war to help others build peace. The galaxy was dangerous, perhaps more so than these young scholars fully understood even now. But it was also full of potential, full of beings willing to learn and grow and create something better than what had come before. Sarah Chun had entered the Galactic Academy as a war-hardened veteran with no place in a peaceful world. She had found her place not by abandoning her past, but by using it to protect the future that others were working to build. And, for the first time since the war ended, that felt like victory enough.